Okay, maybe we should make a start. Can I say, first of all, I think those who just heard some of the chat know that Joseph Dara has written extensively on the Syrian question, and he's done a fantastic job, if I could say it, from after having a look at your blog and other writing, in terms of showing the left that general sympathy with regimes which have previously take anti-Western stance, anti-imperialist stance is not the way to go. You need to have information, you need to support the working class, and to see that we are in a revolution. The Arab Spring has accentuated the need for a revolution throughout the region, and that the question of a Palestinian freedom and liberation from Israeli oppression is intimately linked up with the other regimes. It's not a separate issue. And I think these are points which are made, are sort of lost in much of the current discussion. So this is a very welcome discussion. Just some reminders about the Arab Spring. We've saw the uprising starting in Syria against a regime which had hundreds of thousands of spies, of police, of army, of detailed informers at every way. John Ryman pointed to an article which I also read just before coming in, which shows the innocence, the naivety in a sense, but also the tremendous determination of an uprising from below for democratic rights and the real love of people for being able to be free, of being able to release that human spirit and creativity. So we've seen a struggle which has started as a democratic revolution, which could have turned towards socialist objectives, but being brutally crushed with treacherous and treachery and hypocrisy from the West, which we anticipate, and also decisive intervention from the Putins and the Chinese to make sure that democracy is squashed and smothered in Syria. And that this is Syria, when we look at it as a country, is so intimately connected with the whole region, with the setbacks that there have been in the Egyptian revolution and in many other uprisings throughout the region, and that we want to discuss it, with that regional and international context. So we look very much forward to hearing from you, Joseph. We want to give you maybe now the full 45 minutes. At the same time, we know we'll be expecting contributions from others, and we look forward to a very rich discussion. Thank you for making yourself available.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you, Roger, and thank you all for being here. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And again, I apologize for the last time regarding the conference on Tunis, but I was outside with my daughters. It was a bit difficult to participate now. It should be fine. So first of all, I'll come back maybe on the latest events on Syria, and after going back to the nature of the Syrian regime, the roots of the uprising, the organization from below, how did the regime repress? What were the tools of repression of the regime? What were the limits of the opposition, the leadership opposition, and where are we today regarding? But I think it's important. Yesterday night, just to put you in the picture, the uncle of Bashar al-Assad, Rifat al-Assad, came back to Syria after nearly 40 years of exile, because he tried to make a coup against his brother at the time, the father of Bashar al-Assad, Hafez al-Assad. He's one of a billionaire. He should have spent 4 years now in prison. He's just been condemned in France. France let him go, despite he was condemned to 4 years of prison, to go back to Syria. This is one thing. And also what we have to take into account is that most of the time we speak of Syria as if the war or the uprising is finished, but it's very far from it. The war is very far from being finished. Idlib, which is outside the control of the regime, which is under the control mostly of a reactionary force called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is ex-Al-Qaeda. in Syria, which is a Salafist jihadist group, is still being bombed. Civilians are being bombed. At the same time, we've seen in the past few months and weeks still protests in areas that are under the control of the regime, but not totally, like Dara, which has been the heart and beat, if you want, of the revolution, that where the uprising started in 2011, during the so-called election, the presidential elections in the beginning of the summer, May and June. There were protests against the presidential election and saying the revolution continues, and has been the various areas that protested against this so-called presidential election has been bombed, like Dar al-Balad, which is a neighborhood in Daraa that has been under the control of the opposition, even though the regime came back in 2018 with an agreement with the Russian and opposition forces. But still, you had more than thousands of people displaced because of the bombing of the regime in Daraa. But you also had protests in Sweda. Sweda is a particular area of Syria, which is officially under control of the regime, but has gained some forms of autonomy over the years, and has seen protests, especially progressive protests, demanding, having democratic demands, but also social justice demands around the issue of cost of living, about the necessity of a better conditions of life, etc. We can come back to this and in the discussion if you like. What is important to understand, and why I'm saying this introduction, is that the Syrian revolutionary process, just as the revolutionary processes in the region, is far from being finished. It will last for decades, even though we are today, we should admit it, in a period of defeat, in a period of, I think in the five years, especially of authoritarian and reactionary advances. The latest example of it is the constitutional coup in Tunis that we spoke about, and we're seeing, kind of authoritarian practices of the current president. And in Sudan, it's not going as well forward, despite there's still, opposition from below, which is interesting. But I come back to this into a conclusion. But what is important to understand, again, in introduction, is that we are witnessing a revolutionary process in which I think we entered for decades. Now to come back to Syria. First of all, what is the nature of the regime? The nature of the regime has been built since 1970, when Hafiz al-Assad, so the father of Bashar al-Assad, came to power. If you can imagine, today in Syria, we've been living under the same family rule for 52 years. No, 51 years, sorry, we're still in 21, but nearly to 52 years. So in 1970. And this was in a period where it's obviously a coup in Syria against the leftist Ba'athists, but we have to put it in a larger picture, is the end of the, if you want, the more progressive period of Arab nationalism, especially with the death of Nasser, the arrival of Sadat to power, and Hafiz al-Assad also coming to power. It's the end of a progressive period of Arab nationalism and entering a conservative period with the arrival of Sadat to power in Egypt, Hafiz al-Assad in Syria, and the rising strength, if you want, of especially Gulf countries, etc., in the region, and the rise also of various Islamic fundamentalist forces throughout the 70s and the 80s. So what Hafiz al-Assad did for 30 years, because he stayed into power from 70 to 2000, and after his son took power and is still ruling the country, unfortunately. And I call the country as what he built, Hafiz al-Assad, especially with Bashar al-Assad, a patrimonial regime, meaning that you have a concentration of powers, concentration of political powers, economic powers, and military powers within a small group of people. This is not unique, unfortunately, to Syria, but you find it in the vast majority of I would say, Middle Eastern and North African countries, especially Gulf countries. And after, actually, when Bashar al-Assad came to power, there was an Egyptian sociologist who started to call Syria as a first example, but you could find other examples like this, Jumlukiye, which means it's a mix between, in Arabic, it's a mix between republic and a monarchy. And it was really a monarchy. And today, until today, the supporters of Syria speak of Suriyat al-Assad, yani Syria of the Assad, just like you would speak of the Saudi kingdom, basically the Saudi kingdom. If you know, historically speaking, this name is from the Saudi family. Until today, it's a form of monarchy, but you could form other forms of republic in the Middle East and Africa that were kind of monarchies. The Libya of Gaddafi's, the Iraq of Saddam Hussein, the Egypt of Mubarak, etc., were preparing their sons to take over very clearly. And he built a patrimonial regime, as I was saying, concentrating all the different powers into a small clique. And this was even more strengthened and deepened with Bashar al-Assad coming to power in 2000. What changed, I would say, between the period of Hafez al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad is the deepening of neoliberal policies. Whereas Hafez al-Assad slowly started a policy of economic liberalization, especially in the mid-80s, it was accelerated and deepened under the rule of Bashar al-Assad. And even for the first time in Syria, you had the IMF advising the regime regarding its neoliberal policies. And all the same kind of policies that you witness in other Middle Eastern and North African countries regarding privatizations of various sectors of the economy, austerity measures, cutting subsidies. And we're witnessing today, the cutting of subsidies in various countries that are creating, deep negative consequences, especially regarding subsidies of oil derivatives. We've witnessed this in Sudan in June. Lebanon is witnessing this. And Syria has been witnessing this for a long period as well. And in this period, when Bashar al-Assad came to power, the productive economy weakened, and most of the investments and the growth was witnessed within trade, service economies, etc., which again is not particular only to Syria. When it comes to the Middle East and North Africa, most of the growth that you witnessed, the so-called growth that we witnessed for the years before the uprising, were concentrating in luxury, real estate, trade, services, financialization, while the productive economy was being weakened. And Syria was no different. And therefore, some of the so-called lies of the regime was to present itself as socialist, as anti-imperialist, and secular, all which I call the three big lies. It was not secular until today. The regime, if you want to be the president of Syria officially, you need to be Muslim. When it comes to most of the teaching in public school regarding Islam, it's only one branch of Islam, Islam Sunni, that has to be taught, where you have a lot of Islamic minorities in Syria, etc. When it comes to socialism, very far from it, or it's the socialism of the Assad family. They share the profits between or among them, if you want. But the private economy used to be 70% of the economy, while 30%, 25% was the public sector, and huge privatization, huge socio-economic differences. For example, poverty increased from 14% in 2000 to 33% in 2010, while you had just 30% of the people living just above the poverty line. So nearly 60% of the people living under the poverty line. And anti-imperialists, historically speaking, Hafez al-Assad has been one of the regime that has killed the most Palestinians, obviously after Israel. But I'm saying it is in competition with Jordan following the Black September, if you know, in 70, when you had a Palestinian uprising, but also allied with the Jordanian left. And in Syria actually intervened in Lebanon in 76 against the Palestinian national resistance and the leftist movements in Lebanon to break it. while Syria also participated in the 91 intervention of the US and other countries worldwide against Iraq occupation of Kuwait. So they participated to this military campaign. And other example could be showed, also its participation in the so-called war on terror launched by George Bush, collaboration with Bush, etc. So this was the nature of the regime. So what are the roots of the uprising? The roots of the uprising are similar in many ways to the other uprisings of the region. The absence of democracy, absence of economic development, and rise of poverty, of unemployment, lack of investments in the productive sectors of the economy, etc. And why did it started then? It's because of what people saw on television, basically, with the rise of uprising in Tunis, Egypt, and Bahrain, Libya. Obviously, it brought new ideas, especially for the new generation that had not, if you want, witnessed and lived the repression of the 80s. They saw possibilities of change in Syria, possibilities of change. And therefore, you know, as Lenin used to say, during years, nothing happens, but in few weeks, the world basically can change. And this is what we witnessed in Syria in the beginning of the uprising with, in the beginning, I would say tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands after a couple of weeks, and after millions of people demonstrating throughout Syria to ask, first of all, for regime, but for reform, but after for regime change. And regime change from below. Obviously, I'm not talking about regime change coming from outside, from foreign powers, etc. And how did the people organize from below? So one of the major, and after actually we don't speak enough about this, is that you had whole parts of Syria being outside of the control of the regime, literally speaking, more than 50%. And people had to organize themselves from below. So they organized through local coordination committees, through various groups from below. Local coordination committees were mostly led by Democrats, progressive. I wouldn't call them, you know, radical leftists, etc. But they were progressive Democrats in general, mostly seculars, and seeking, you know, a democratic Syria with equal rights for citizens, etc. And local coordination groups and other forms of local coordination groups or local groups organizing throughout Syria, demonstrations, but also when the regime was kicked out of some areas or withdrew from some areas, they started to organize the whole, you know, neighborhood, village, city on their own. So, for example, the first example of a city, of the main city of a governorate being liberated from the regime was Raqqa. Raqqa was completely self-organized in 2012. Before it was well known, unfortunately, because of the arrival of Daesh, so the so-called Islamic State, establishing its so-called capital with Mosul in these areas. You had more than 50 organizations being registered with the local council, because you also had local council being established with activists playing a role, trying to basically manage their own society. You also had Eastern Aleppo, which was, we're talking about at the beginning when Eastern Aleppo in the end of 2012, end of the summer 2012, was liberated from regime-held areas, from regime control. We're talking about more than 1.5 million people trying to self-organize themselves. And so there were some forms of democratic experience, and you could find this. We have to know at the end of the summer 2012, more than 50% of Syria was outside of the control of the regime. So just to put your, and people were trying to self-organize from below, were trying, you know, to organize the society alternatively. And actually ideas, what is important to remember is that some of these ideas of local councils, of self-organization from below, came from activists from the progressive sector, from democratic sectors. And actually we had in the if you want, outside of Damascus, what we call in Arabic, Rif Dimashq, which is basically the countryside of Damascus, which is a governorate, which is very large. It was actually an idea coming from an anarchist activist called Ammar Aziz that was that died in the jails of the regime. He was imprisoned and died in it. So he had various experiences like this from trying to organize from below. But as I always say, we shouldn't also completely romanticize this period, as I think some people do among the Syrian revolution, saying, it was nearly, Soviets or, experiences, socialist alternatives. There were limits, especially regarding the participation of women. Only 50% of these local councils or were democratically elected. Otherwise, they were, chosen between the various forces in place, or they were basically designated by the armed opposition forces. There was a lack of minorities. Because it's important to know Syria is, I don't know if you know the demography of Syria, but basically Syria is 70% composed of Arab Sunni, but 30% is various kinds of minorities. You have Kurdish that is between 10-15%. You have Christians that is 5 to 10%. Alawis that is 10 to 12 to 13, which is Alawis is basically a branch of Shia Islam. And it's where it's the religion of the Assad family. And you have the Druze, you have the Ismailis, you have various kinds of denominations. So, and this was lacking definitely. So this is about the organization from below. Maybe one word regarding the armed opposition, how it started. It started as, people try to defend themselves and to defend their own neighborhoods, their villages, etc. And actually the majority of them were not military soldiers that defected from the army, but were civilians that took up arms for the far majority. And only a small minority were coming from the Syrian army. Actually, the people that defected from the Syrian army left the country and were very often unable to play a role in the armed opposition groups. So very often they had a collaboration with local civilian groups. But throughout time, and I'll come to this later, but with the various interventions from the so-called friends of Syria, and as I always say, if you have friends like this, please leave them. Very directly now, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey basically tried to Islamize the uprising, and they were actually scared to see a democratic uprising in Syria, to see a democratic experience close to their, their borders, etc. And they started to support mostly Islamic fundamentalist forces, and progressively, the armed opposition groups were dominated by the end of 2013, beginning of 2014, by reactionary groups, Islamic fundamentalist groups, and the vast majority. For some of them, taking example on the Taliban, on others taking example on Al-Qaeda, and we also had the Daesh. And it's important to remind as well that the Syrian regime facilitated their rise. Obviously, because for the regime, historically speaking, it's always been better to face, kind of a mirror of himself, because the Islamic fundamentalist forces basically are pro-neoliberal, are reactionary, and they scare a vast majority of the people, and not only minorities, but if also, Muslims just living their lives, whether conservative or liberals, in the main cities like Aleppo and Damascus. They scared them, and actually the regime liberated the main leaders of the biggest Islamic fundamentalist groups that were developed during the uprising. And there was this famous picture at the beginning of the uprising. The amnesty, basically the various amnesty granted by the regime were mostly done in favor of jihadist and Salafist jihadist personalities. So this is important to remind as well. How did the regime was able to maintain itself? Because as I explained to you, basically at the end of 2012, it was, the regime was nearly collapsing. The opposition was at the door of Damascus. Half of Aleppo was outside of its control, and half of Syria was outside of its own control. I think there's a couple of reasons why. First of all, the patrimonial nature of the regime, as I explained to you. And this is a main difference, for example, with Egypt and Tunis. In Egypt and Tunis, you could get rid of the head that maintained the regime. This was impossible in Syria, just as in Saudi Arabia, you cannot cut the regime, cut the head of the regime and, and maintain the regime, basically because the concentrations of powers are too strong. And Egypt, the high military leadership can maintain control and domination over the regime while, sacrificing basically Mubarak. And this is what it did. In Tunis as well, they could get rid of Ben Ali, but maintain their main powers. In Syria, it's not possible. The main, military unit in Syria is called the 4th Division. The 4th Division is controlled by Maher al-Assad, the brother of Bashar al-Assad. The main financial personality in Syria until 2020 was Rami Makhlouf, the cousin of Bashar al-Assad. So you cannot have this difference, just as Egypt and Tunis. And this is, I think, an important aspect to take into consideration. The second second important aspect also is the differences among the Syrian society, whether ethnic or religious. When I say this, is the instrumentalization that has been done of it, not the fact that you have differences among the society, which is the main difference. I want really to make myself clear. It's not that the fact that you have a diversity within society, but it's the instrumentalization that you can make of it, which is important. Where Egypt and Tunis are very much homogeneous society, different from Syria, Iraq, or Lebanon. And the third and main one, very most important, is the geopolitical importance of Syria. Without the assistance of Russia and Iran, the Syrian regime would have failed. We must be very clear. Until today, it's very much supported by these two forces. So first of all, Iran, and it's also its proxy forces, or if you want, its militias, or like Hezbollah, or the various Iraqi sectarian militias helping the Syrian regime. Iran started very early to intervene in Syria, and more massively since 2012. Russia started to intervene massively through air intervention by 2015. And without this, the Syrian regime would have failed, very clearly. We must be very clear about this. Until today, it's very much supported by these two powers. For example, when it comes to the provision of oil, Syria is still very much dependent on the provision of oil from Iran. Syria, for example, according to government officials, produce only 20,000 barrel oil per day. They need per day 200,000 barrel oil per day. Most of it is provided by Iran, and small part of it is being bought to the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is dominated by the Kurdish PYD, which is the sister party of the PKK. And I think you know it. I don't need to go into to explain this. So what is very important to understand is the place of imperialist forces and especially Russia and the regional power Iran to save the Syrian regime. Why? For Iran, Syria is the last ally, it's the most important ally in the region. And it's the main gate and to assist Hezbollah, which is, as you know, Iranian proxy force in Lebanon and the region, in a way to pressure Israel to have a better, basically, better position when it comes to negotiation with the US. And it's important to understand that it's not about the Palestinian liberation for Iran. It's about having a better negotiation equilibrium coming to Israel and the US. This is a major difference. And therefore, maintaining the Syrian regime in this optic was key. Well, regarding Russia also, after losing the Libya of Gaddafi, it was the last main ally in the region. In addition to this, you have the port of Latakia and Russian port that is really important. When in its development that was announced in 2008 by Vladimir Putin, and that it's optic to have various, if you want, port in the Mediterranean to pressure European forces, etc. So in geopolitical forces, while Syria has been an ally for Russia for a long time, even going back to the USSR. now I come maybe to the limits of the main opposition forces, which is linked also to the various, imperialist and regional forces. I think the limits of the opposition come back from before 2011, and especially rooted in this collaboration between the liberal forces and Islamic fundamentalist forces such as the Muslim Brotherhood. And this was since the Damascus Spring, which is a movement of democracy in Syria that was repressed by the Bashar al-Assad in the beginning of 2000s. And afterwards, I think some sections of the left that became basically liberal forces, like the former Syrian Communist Party Political Bureau, that first of all in the 70s cut its relationship or defected from the official Syrian Communist Party that was allied with the regime. Which has already been, which basically seek an alliance since the 80s and the 70s, 80s with the Muslim Brotherhood to try to overthrow the Syrian regime. And we've witnessed the same thing after 2011. And basically, how do you want to bring people to you with a platform that is basically saying they were advocating for neoliberal policies? They were very sectarian, very having a very negative position, to say the least, around the Kurdish issue, refusing any kind of Kurdish self-determination forces or even Kurdish self-determination decision or right. Imagine on the first meeting of the Syrian opposition in the July 2011 in Turkey, most of these forces, liberal and Islamic Muslim Brotherhood, refused to change the name of the country from Syrian Arab Republic to Syrian Republic, which is a very much symbolic thing. And this coalition basically had no democratic appeal. And throughout the years, they showed they have been not democratic, and even supporting, since the beginning of the uprising, a Turkish intervention or international intervention in Syria. And they supported in 2019 the Turkish occupation of Afrin, which is a Kurdish majority in held areas that was held by the Kurdish forces of the PYD. They supported Erdogan quite clearly. They supported also, for the vast majority of them, the intervention, the military intervention of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, etc., while having a sectarian discourse, calling for the death of Alawites, etc. So, they didn't have a platform basically that could appeal for a vast majority of Syrians. And they never did have a really big importance within Syria. The most legitimacy they had was from the Western powers and regional powers that were the so-called Friends of Syria. But on the grounds, and they were very much criticized by the various forces on the ground with the local coordination committees or various progressive left.
Joseph, another 7 minutes to 10 minutes.
Okay, no problem. The other main reason is the so-called Friend of Syria. As I said, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey tried since the beginning to sectarianize and ethnicize this uprising for their various reasons. While in the first 6 months of the uprising, as a reminder, they tried to find, a kind of an agreement with the Syrian regime. For your reminder, they even sent, emissaries to find a deal with the regime. So this is important. So to know also the limitation of the regime, and also that leftist forces that have been, repressed by regime for the past 30 years were not very present or trying to organize, but very much repressed. And a lot of leftists actually played the role within local coordination committees, etc. Regarding trade unions, we didn't have independent trade unions. Also, this was completely disregarded by the various opposition liberal forces. We didn't have independent trade unions like in Egypt, and I think this is something we will have to work on it, but it hasn't been done in the past. It's a structure that is very similar to Egypt, where you have a main, basically, general federation trade union, which is more a form of control and repression against workers that advancing their rights. So this is why, basically, if you want, the Syrian uprising failed and the Syrian regime was able to remain, but with huge difficulties and huge challenges, as I can tell today, as explained in the beginning. For example, when it comes to the political economy of Syria, today, 90% nearly of Syrians live under the poverty line. the Syrian regime is still very much, supported by its various foreign forces, especially Iran and Russia. Regarding normalization, the normalization of Syria, I would say, is not advancing as the path that the Syrian regime would see, and it's still very slow. And I think it's very much linked to the file of Iran and Syria. When Iran and the US, when the Iran and US would advance, it will advance the Syrian case. But otherwise, the US is not ready to normalize relationship with Syria. And when it comes to Gulf countries, obviously it has advanced, especially with the UAE and partially with Saudi Arabia, even though not officially. But they're not ready to invest in Syria for various reasons. Sanctions, obviously, but not only. Capacities to make, profits and capital accumulation in Syria is very, very small because the infrastructures are completely destroyed and there's no political economic stability. As I told you, still very much the war is not finished, far from it. And actually we're witnessing a comeback of Daesh in the past 2 years. The rise of attacks made by the so-called Islamic State in the past 2 years has not ceased. And actually, as I always say, you cannot put an end to the Islamic State only militarily, but you will only put an end to this kind of groups through democracy, social justice, economic development, independence, true independence from below, etc. Another issue that has been we haven't talked about during this discussion, but I didn't have the link, is the Kurdish issue. Kurdish issue is opposed both by the regime and the Syrian opposition in its vast majority, especially the liberal Islamic fundamentalist forces. And what we've seen is since 2012, the rise of the PYD, which is the sister party of the PKK, which was not the dominant Kurdish political party at the beginning of 2011. Actually, most of the Kurdish protesters were not from political parties, but youngsters. There were only 2 political parties that was, supporting clearly the revolution at the beginning was the Future Movement and the YKT party, which was a gathering of various leftist and nationalist Kurdish party. And today, the PYD is transformed, if you want, they're still very much present, but today what we call the autonomous administrative of the northeast of Syria is controlling basically 10 to 15% of Syria, but it's controlling very important areas of Syria where you find the oil, and it's the breadbasket of Syria. And is today having between 200,000 to 300,000 employees between military and civilian officials. So it's a big, it has some forms of legitimacy on the ground. Is it, a new form of Commune de Paris, as it was presented by some on the left, especially among, which is interesting to see autonomous parties? No, it's very far. It's a very much authoritarian forms of organization. PYD and PKK historically has not been, very much keen towards democratic discussions among its comrades, let's say it like this. It's authoritarian, and at the same time, it's been able to include various forms of minority, especially Syrians, which is an ethnicity, but Christian minority as well, some from Arab leaderships and Arab tribes. And as well, it's presenting, a very much progressive appeal, pushing for women's participation in civilian administration, but also army. And there's been, progress when it comes to women's rights in these areas. Also, its secular aspect is pushing for secular laws, much more. So it has some progressive appeals, and I would say is the most or the less worst democratic perspective within Syria today, with a massive following. And it's also important to take into account that it's important for a Kurdish population that has been historically repressed in Syria to be able to self-rule themselves. And I think this is very important. And for me, and I think just like Turkey, the Kurdish issue is a way in to think about another Syria that is democratic, social justice, and secular, and not ethno-nationalist based and capitalist, etc. It's a way in to bring forward other issues. We can come back to this later in the discussion. In conclusion, where are we now? What are the hopes? I think it's very hard today to see some hope in Syria. As I told you, 90% of poverty. The regime is controlling 70% of the country. The Syrian opposition, the official opposition outside is unlegitimate and reactionary in many aspects. The Syrian left is very weak, very divided, with a very small presence within Syria, and it until today, very nearly impossible to organize, to self-organize within trade union, within society. Syrian regime remains a very repressive regime, one of the most repressive regime in the region. It has killed more than 90% of the more than 500,000 of people dead since the beginning of the uprising. There's no capacity to, as I was saying, to organize, and it's very authoritarian regimes. But at the same time, the Syrian regime cannot reimpose a form of hegemony, a form of passive hegemony, passive hegemony, meaning just as before the 2010, meaning that whereas it cannot impose a form of hegemony where people buy into the ideology, because the Syrian regime doesn't have anymore any kind of ideology anymore. It's more about remaining regime, remaining in power. You still have outburst of criticism against the regime, of protests, as I was talking in introduction, and even among what we call loyalists, or people that have been regions that have remained under the control of the regime. People have been more outspoken about lack of social justice, lack of economic development, repression, etc. But the absence of democracy, absence of economic development does not transform automatically into a new uprising. And the lack of alternative is the biggest problem today of Syria. The lack of massive organization from below. And I think there's lessons to be learned from Tunis with the UGTT, the main trade unions, even with its limitation, or the trade union forces in Sudan, and in both countries as well. And I always say it's very important. In both countries, you had a mass feminist organized movement. So these two pillars to work on, to bring forward, democratic and social demands are key. And this is what I think we have to build on, learning from our mistakes, to build forward, new resistance from below in Syria in the future. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer various questions, discussion, criticism, etc.
Okay, thanks. Really, that's marvelous introduction, Joseph. And I think you did marvelously in linking up the uprising to the regional relations and how those become polarized when it's faced by the prospect of rule by the people in any one of the regimes, in any one of the countries, overthrowing the existing regimes and bringing in genuinely democratic form of governance is almost incomprehensible to the West, to Russia, to China, and the rest. So, the people are very much, on their own. And yet there's the uprising is not finished. And it's a marvelous tribute to the strength of people, many who have been imprisoned, oppressed in so many different ways. And again, the point you made about how there are divisions between people, all kinds of tribal divisions or religious sectarian divisions and so forth, but how they're instrumentalized, they can be overcome. And this marvelous visions of how those could be overcome. And yet the regime relies on all these splits and divisions. Okay, so look, let's open up the discussion. As usual, if you could please indicate by putting up your hand officially. In other words, with the, if you go down to reaction and click on there, where it says raise hand, or otherwise just do raise your hand, but quite visibly, because now we've grown to at least 24. So it's a little bit difficult to see. So rather, please try to raise your hand electronically. I have at the moment Jerry, and then Ken, and then Beatrix. Jerry?
Yeah, oh, okay, I just unmuted myself. Well, I think there was one missing element, well, one major missing element in the speech, and that was the role of the United States. The role of the United States was not condemned. It wasn't even mentioned at all as any kind of a factor. And the role of the Friends of Syria was, of course, to act on behalf of the United States. And of course, the role of the CIA. You put the takeover of the various forces by reactionaries at around 2013 to 2014. I would say it came somewhat earlier than that, when they dominated. And for the life of me, I really cannot see how it is that we now have the uprising still going on, led by this vile reactionary forces, the head-chopping jihadists who throw gay people off tall buildings and slaughter all minorities. How is this a prospect of a step forward? The cities basically support Assad. And the cities basically support Assad because they know what a bastard he is and what a bastard he was. But they know that if these jihadists take over, they'll be in a far, far worse situation than they are now. So they support him because they don't want to end up in that terrible situation. And for the life of me as well, I cannot see how you can tell us about the Great Revolution in Libya. How well that worked out, didn't it? Really, the revolution that was supported by the CIA and the NATO and Hillary Clinton, we saw he died. What a great celebration that was. Now we have two forces representing France on one side and Italy on the other, battling it out for the island in Libya. What kind of a revolution? And what kind of a situation would Syria have ended up in had the United States succeeded in its regime change operation? As bad and if not much worse than Libya at the moment. In fact, I think that the intervention of Iran and the intervention in Russia were progressive things. I think they stopped the total dismemberment of state. They defended Syria's sovereignty, or as much of it as they could. And you didn't mention, in fact, that when we're talking about the PYD and who it was and who it is that supports the PYD, it is, of course, Israel and the United States. That's the forces. I've just read in the Observer today that Israel is bombing on behalf of the PYD to assist them against Turkey at the moment. But of course, we know what Donald Trump did there. Anyways, that's all I have to say. I'm sorry, I do have to leave for another webinar shortly, but that's my piece. Thank you.
Okay.
No, but if he has to leave, if he has to leave, let me answer because
all right, yeah.
Okay.
Because we cannot say some things like this and let go. Actually, the first thing I wrote before after I finished my discussions was Western forces and the US. Totally agree, I should have mentioned it. But what you said is completely incorrect, to tell you honestly. US had never a program of regime change. And I can find you tens or 20 statements of US officials saying they don't want regime change in Syria. So let's be clear on the fact, please. And the biggest lesson of Iraq was no regime change, basically at the beginning of the uprisings. And Obama said it clearly, and all US officials said it clearly, there was no regime change. What the US wanted was a change, basically replacing Assad by one of the generals from the Syrian army. But this is one of the main importance of difference, what I say, between the difference between Syria and other countries, that you cannot replace the head in expecting to change the regime, just like in Egypt or Tunis, etc. You cannot do this because there's a concentration of powers within a small group, especially a small family. So the US never had regime change. And actually, they stopped at one point at the beginning of the uprising, they stopped the sending of weapons that allowed for the shooting of helicopters and planes. They stopped it that were being sent from Turkey to being entered through Syria. This is the CIA that did this. And actually, there was a plan by the CIA of 500 million to assist Syrian opposition forces that was never implemented, simply because they could not find group of the Syrian opposition groups that agreed to only fight Daesh. Because this was the only agreement, the only way the US would support various Syrian opposition forces was saying no attacks against the Syrian regime, only against Daesh. And the only group that basically afterwards accepted this deal is the PYD, the Syrian Democratic Forces today. And yes, you're right, the Syrian Democratic Forces are supported by the US, but not by Israel. This is completely untrue. And actually, historically speaking, PKK have martyrs against Israel in the 80s when they were fighting in Lebanon against Israel. And what you're talking about is that Israel supported the referendum of Kurdistan in Iraq, by the way, just as I did, because I support the self-determination Kurdish people, but obviously they did it for different reasons that are reactionary. Again, I said, for me, what happened is that it's not true to say that the cities supported Assad, but they were scared of the alternative coming from end of 2013, 2014, as I said it. And I want to be very clear of it. I always opposed Islamic fundamentalist forces, and I never had any kind of illusion. And I think I have a straight record around this. Since 2012, you can find an article I wrote against Jabhat al-Nusra. 2012 in the summer. One of the first pieces, and I did it in Arabic, English, and French, saying we should oppose Jabhat al-Nusra, we should oppose terrorist attacks within cities.
We will have the right to reply, even if Jerry's not there.
Okay.
And it's important for us all, because it's not just Jerry's points, it's everyone to respond.
Okay, I'll stop here. And
okay, no, I apologize for that. But
no, it makes sense. No, just to make clear some facts.
No, I think those are pretty robust. Okay, now, John, if I could ask John to come in, and please, it will be very time constrained, John, because Jerry's about to leave, and I want to open the debate, not to be a dialogue with Jerry, okay? Thanks.
Right. I think that Jerry's comments were fairly typical of a wide sector of the so-called left, but it's interesting. And really, I had wanted to comment on some other things which are far more fruitful discussion than answering these comments, which basically actually support counter-revolution. And I know that's a very harsh statement, but it's factual, because it's no accident that the position that Jerry took is a position of outright fascists here in the United States and others. They also take the identical position that the choice is either between the counter-revolutionary Assad or the counter-revolutionary Islamic fundamentalists. And they base all of this on their supposed opposition to US imperialism. Well, one thing that I've always noticed about them is they talk about US war crimes in Syria. But the biggest war crime that the US committed in Syria, which was the massive destruction of Raqqa, they never ever mention, or almost never mention. Why? Because that was a war crime that was actually committed in actual point of fact in support of the Syrian regime. And so it doesn't fit into their narrative. And basically what his position and the position of this fairly significant sector of the left, including people like Chris Hedges and others, their position, what it reflects is the old Stalinist view that the working class and the masses of working class people in the former colonial world are just simply pawns in a wider game. that they play no role whatsoever. They are just the objects of history. And all we really care about is what they call the big game. That is the struggle between various imperialist forces, or in the past between imperialism and the Soviet Union. And it really shows the massive degeneration of wide sectors of the left today. I'd like to comment and later on a more fruitful aspect of the discussion.
Okay, John, you will be, you will have a right to come in. Okay. Look, I think we now have Ken.
Thank you, and thank you, Joseph, for your talk. My question is a little more narrowly focused, perhaps. I was intrigued by your mentioning that Rifat al-Assad has now returned to Syria. Press reports appear to indicate this was largely to avoid imprisonment in France. Do you believe that Rifat al-Assad still has any kind of power base in Syria? And is there any possibility he might use it either for or against Bashar al-Assad himself? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ken. That was quite brief. Look, I don't see any other hands up right now. Please indicate. I would have given more time, but I thought we didn't want to crowd out a much wider discussion. I can see the hand waving. Please come in.
John. Yeah, a question I'd like to ask is how big a minority is the Alawites? Because it was painted at the start of the Syrian uprising that Assad had a large sector of the Syrian population behind him, mostly the Alawites Muslim group. Again, I think the Assad family are part of that grouping. And the other thing that came over was, particularly when Daesh, began to seriously develop, that many minorities, particularly Christians and non-Sunni Muslims, were worried about Daesh and that they backed the Assad regime. I mean, I put it from the point of view that the Assad regime has blood on its hands going back, prior to this present uprising. I understand that some 20 or 30 years ago, there was an uprising in a Syrian city and something like 100,000 people were killed by Bashar al-Assad. And it just really gets me, the horrific picture you painted in terms of the opposition, support for Saudi Arabia against Yemen, and also the role of women, and just the totally anti-democratic attitude and the attitude towards, the Kurdish minority. Unfortunately, when one looks at the Kurdish minority in the Middle East, they don't seem to have a unified position in terms of what they want to see in terms of some form of Kurdish autonomy, a Kurdish state. Kurds in Iraq have a different position from Kurds in Syria, or that's the way it comes over. And Kurds in Syria have a different position from the Kurds, the biggest group, the Kurds in Turkey. These are some issues, if you could perhaps develop some of those issues.
Okay, thanks for those points. John, and then Jimmy.
Why don't I wait for Jimmy, since I've already spoken once?
Okay, fair enough. Jimmy, go ahead.
Okay, well, I go a bit brief because it's only a simple question. And it's simple because it's isolated to one particular aspect. I'm of the opinion that irrespective of who was the regime, who was the leader of the regime and what form of regime that there was in Syria, and no matter who the opposition was and whatever form it was, there was little or no possibility of an intervention by neighboring countries or by an uprising inside succeeding if the interests of Russia, plain and simple, the military interests specifically of Russia, were challenged. I do not think that Russia would have allowed itself lose its Mediterranean bases. And sometimes I think that particular point is overlooked, that it's purely a military thing for the Russians as much as it's political and commercial. So I'd just like to hear viewpoints on that.
Okay, John and then Ed.
Okay, well, first of all, I think that we should all recognize the extreme importance of this subject, not just Syria, but the Arab Spring as a whole, because the Arab Spring set off a whole wave of struggle against capitalism, even if it wasn't consciously against capitalism, but a whole wave of struggle against capitalism, and raised the consciousness of millions of workers all throughout the world, not only in that particular part of the world, but globally. And likewise, the defeat, even if it may be just a temporary defeat, but I think it has been defeated. The defeat of the Arab Spring has had the opposite effect. And so this is something more than just like academic interest. And the question for me is, how could that have ended up differently? I think that's what we have to ask ourselves. And I heard what Joseph said about the local coordinating committees, that they were not Soviets and so on, and that we shouldn't exaggerate them. But in my view, I think that we also should not underestimate their potential. And in some areas, they took the place. They were the force that actually organized society, including the economy. And they were somewhat on a class basis, as I will, for instance, in this is a quote from Harper's Magazine, where the author, the journalist, visited some of these local coordinating committees. And he says, in the neighboring town of Benish, I visited the Farmers' Council, a body of about 1,000 members that set grain prices and adjudicated land disputes. Its leader, an old man I'll call Abdul Hakim, explained to me that before then he goes on about how they set prices and so on. And the Public Affairs Committee of one of the village's revolutionary councils meets. A mustached man slams his hand down on the floor and shouted, "This is a revolution of the poor. The rich will have to accept that." So there was, at least on a semi-conscious or even unconscious way, the beginnings of the class struggle overtly in at least some of those local coordinating councils. Now, one thing, as I understand it, there was no consistent effort to recruit representatives of the soldiers who were in many cases in rebellion. No consistent effort to recruit them into those local coordinating councils. But also, as I understand, in my view, similar developments were occurring elsewhere, maybe in different ways. For instance, in Egypt, during the Arab Spring there, you had the rise of armed women's self-defense committees, which could have then been spread to, taken on a wider form, I believe. You know, I sent around the link to that article by that brilliant journalist, Anand Gopal, whose book, by the way, No Good Men Amongst the Living, about Afghanistan is just, it reads like a novel, actually. It's so well written. But in that article, he explains that there were two international forces that intervened against the revolution. You had Russia and Iran on the side of Assad, and then you had some of the other forces, Saudi Arabia and so on the side of the other counter-revolutionary forces, the Islamic fundamentalists. And therefore, the other question is, where could an international force have developed that could have supported the revolution? And I think that the only answer to that would have been an international workers' movement. But the Syrian revolution was organized on a national basis, just as they all were, although they affected and impacted each other. All the others were also. And so there wasn't a conscious attempt to internationalize it, to regionalize it, to reach out to the workers in Turkey, for instance, or you now see the potential in Iran and also in Europe for a workers' movement to develop. And so my last point is, for that, you would need a mass, conscious, and organized force to build something like that. And that gets back to, in a way, some of the, gives us, opens up we can understand some of the significance of what Jerry Downing had said. It shows the disastrous collapse of the international left. And I think that that also has to be considered.
Thank you for your points, particularly in the relation to the effect on the general mood. You know, if the Arab revolution, the spring had succeeded, we would have had a huge uprising in Africa too. Would have spread from the north to the south. Ed, would you like to come in?
Thanks, Joseph, for your very interesting introduction. And I apologize that I missed the first part of it because I was late to the meeting. So you might have already covered the question that I'm going to ask. I mean, I think it's very refreshing to hear your account of what happened in Syria and the processes going on, because many of the comments in the Western press are simply around the sort of liberal idea that because the Assad regime was so brutal and so violent, the revolution or the attempt at revolution was not successful. And that's, you know, that's an utterly inadequate explanation of what was going on. And it's clear from what you've said, Joseph, and from what other comrades have said in this meeting, that, you know, there at certain stages in the beginning of this movement, there were progressive movements straining to develop some kind of some kind of genuine revolutionary approach that would bring together peoples of different ethnicities and so on. It was the beginning, the elemental beginning of revolution. What I'd like more comment on, and I might have missed it, is how did that break down? I mean, if there were working class people, peasants, poor people, and so on, trying to organize in villages, in communities, beginning to try and lay the foundations of a society that was more democratic and more egalitarian. How did it break down into a situation where the the religious bigots and the military people dominated the situation? So it's a question. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ed. I've had an indication from Roger, who would like to come in.
Well, thank you. First of all, thanks to Joseph. I thought it was an absolutely fascinating introduction, and I learned a huge amount from him. I just wanted to make a few general points, partly arising from Jerry's comments, but unfortunately, halfway through Jerry's contribution, I had a problem with my computer and I disappeared for a bit. So I must apologize in advance if I misinterpreted anything he said. But so I just confine myself to saying, because I know that there is enormous confusion in the labor movement in relation to, to the whole events in the region, but especially in relation to the Syrian civil war. The atrocities by the Assad regime are absolutely blood-curdling and horrific. I mean, it is a monstrous regime, near genocidal in its approach, and it's also quite clearly a kleptocracy of the Assad family. Let's remember also its extremely reactionary role in the past. For instance, its compliance with the USA in making its torture chambers available for extraordinary rendition in the so-called war on terror. So why is it? It seems a bit of a paradox. So this is among large sections of the left, so little protest and even sometimes excuses and alibis given for the regime. I think it's partly, of course, an instinctive revulsion at the role of US imperialism in attacking all those regimes in the region in the past which had ever dared to defy it, from the time of Nasser in relation to Saddam, and even Gaddafi, who'd already completely capitulated to them before they became complicit in his overthrow. There's also the residue of suspicion against America after the lie about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. There's the sympathy, if you like, accorded to Syria by the fact that the Golan Heights are still occupied after half a century by Israel. And there's also, I think, a factor is the memory of the policies of the regime of Assad Senior, the father, in the 1960s when he nationalized practically the entire economy. At least that's the impression that I had. At that time, Ted Grant, who we all have a lot of respect for, but at one time, I think getting a little bit carried away perhaps, but characterized Syria as a deformed worker state, and also Burma in the late 60s. I think, as I say, that was it's retrospectively we can see that was a premature characterization. Since then, I understand that again, perhaps Joseph could confirm it. There's been, I think, pretty well 100% privatization of the Syrian economy, and as I say, largely into the hands of the Assad family themselves. How else do we explain also this this strange mutation, if you like, of the process that could be expected from sections of the left? It's also, of course, a reflex reaction to the Labour leaders who always automatically, except in the Corbyn period, of course, who always slavishly followed the policy of US imperialism, and a kind of misplaced application of the idea that you resist your own ruling class. It's a misunderstanding of the fact that the policy of American imperialism is extremely eclectic, and it's as with the Saddam regime, for instance, in the end they came in to overthrow or to destroy the Saddam regime, but previously they'd supported Saddam in the Iran-Iraq war. The same way in relation to Gaddafi, that one time he was the great monster and the bogeyman, but they ended up for several years before his overthrow in complete collusion, or he was in complete collusion with British and with US imperialism. So imperialism eclectically collaborated at times with all these regimes. I think also it's a mark of the shifting balance and the decline of US imperialism as the unchallenged dominant superpower in the world today. The crumbling of these regimes and the completely unstable relations and contradictory policies of the great powers in this region. I'd finally just like to ask Joseph if he could give some prognosis of how he expects the situation to unfold and what prospects there are for the future of the revolution in Syria and the region as a whole.
Thanks, Roger. Look, I think we've had quite a wide-ranging discussion. Could I make a few points from the chair? You know, what we've been faced with the Arab Spring was, in a sense, a deeply democratic movement. And a democratic movement which is genuinely democratic and rigorously democratic ends up with taking up all the social questions. And then you end up with resolving the question of capitalism when it's not faced immediately as the first issue. And that's called the permanent revolution. And we find all the positives and the negatives from that law. Because what we find is that when a regime is challenged on a democratic basis, it reacts, it becomes reactionary, it builds up massively its armies and its police force, and most importantly, its secret intelligence operators in multiple intelligence organizations, as we've seen even in South Africa in the past, although it's a bit of a mess now. But you can imagine that Assad really developed a most intrinsically ornate means of repressing populations, but it wasn't specific to him. I was listening the other day to an Egyptian Democrat of some kind speaking from Washington, DC. And he was saying, I'm speaking from a cafe, a coffee shop here in DC, and I could expect to be shot at any time. And he's speaking from DC. In other words, the regime, Sisi and others, will follow you to the ends of the earth until they exterminate you. This is what these regimes represent. And I don't think the left or the pink left or the whatever they are, the sort of existing current that Roger so carefully characterized as being somewhat opposed to the ruling class because it has made a mess, and that we know very well. But that you therefore just say the opposite at any time, because none of these issues are simple now. We have complexity. We have the complexity of what I've seen, with the Kurdish autonomous movements and so forth, of women being armed and actually, radically active in changing their situation. And yet there may be some components of the West involved in that. But does that mean that those people need to be exterminated? That is not the conclusion we would draw from that situation. The ANC in South Africa was one time called a terrorist organization. At the same time, all the Western intelligence organizations were actively cooperating in it to be able to turn it into exactly the opposite. As Roger explained, the operation of the CIA and of Western imperialism in general is eclectic. It can hop from one rock to the other and try to cross a river. And it might hop backwards or forwards, and we don't, we can't know what our tradition is, what our orientation is to ordinary working people. And I thought that John's quote from the people saying this is a revolution of the poor, and the rich just have to put up with it. That's exactly what Assad understands too, and that's why he's suppressing this movement. It's a movement of the poor. And that's what all these regimes are totally hostile to. At times you'll find that the students are active, the youth are active, intellectuals are active, although the left is in such division as Joseph has explained. We had hoped to see something better, but the issues are complex and we have to study them rigorously, as I think John has done, and I think others are also doing, to be able to understand this complexity so that we can cut a path through the forest of lies and confusion and contradictory facts and come through with a path towards democracy, genuine democracy, and socialism. There are so many traps along the way. There's so many living lies, in the way in which issues are presented. This is a major issue. This raised in particular in relation to work that I've done, not absolutely my top priority, but in the Palestinian movement, where you can see that every person who speaks up for Palestinian liberation, which I totally support, is in some way or other linked up to denying the complicity of the internal Palestinian authorities regime and its oppression of people and annihilation of opposition. And that's all tied up with one or other Arab state and the lack of democracy throughout the region. So the geopolitical issues are very important, but they mustn't blind us to the fact that this is an uprising of the poor, struggling for democracy against decades and even centuries of oppression from the West and by local oppressors, and now for the first time being able to flex their muscles and to find that the regimes are totally hostile to them. Could I say just one point in conclusion? In DC, about 3 years ago, they had an exhibition by a photographer. The photographer was somebody who had to take pictures of every single person that was exterminated in the cells, the secret police cells, by the secret police, and then present that personally to Assad. I mean, you cannot believe the brutality, the disgusting level of oppression, of this regime. And I think we need to spell this out because we've got 101 false voices, as John has found out, pink ladies or others who are trying to cover over, the bloodthirsty character of this regime. Joseph, I'll give you time to come in.
Well, thank you all for your comments, and yeah, it's really interesting, and I mostly agree with a lot what have been said. Just on the last point, obviously, I agree it was a revolution of the poor, especially when you look at the geography of the uprising in Syria. It was mostly from the what we call the banlieue, the most poorest neighborhoods, from Damascus and Aleppo uprising, and Homs, also the three main cities, while the higher liberal middle class or the bourgeoisie were not moving for the vast majority, and the neighborhoods, part of them, it's also the mid-sized town that did not receive the sufficient investment to see the demographic development of these cities, the expansion of population, etc. It was not followed by development of investment in these mid-sized town cities. You had a lack of infrastructures, education, health, etc. And throughout the 2000s, actually, you had a diminution when it came to investment in education, health, and other key sectors of public services, while you had the rise of private sector in education. You had the rise of private education. That was not the case before 2000, basically. Rise of private universities, rise of private health institutions, hospitals, etc. So you had social inequalities growing. And again, as I said in the introduction, Syria, just as the rest of the MENA countries, Middle Eastern and North African countries, were a blockage of economic development for decades. And obviously, for most of the people that went into the street, it was about democracy and also, obviously, I think, economic reasons. However, it's different to say that this was translated politically, I would say, by massive political organization, by massive trade unions, or political parties. And this is why I was saying that Tunis and Sudan are important examples to learn from, and I think to learn also some from mistakes, but also things to learn for people of the region to put forward what kind of alternative that we want, a progressive alternative, etc. And this is not to undermine the limitation that you can find within the gathering of professional workers in Sudan, or the GTT, the main trade union in Tunis. But they had basically political tools to put forward democratic as well as social demands, which was unfortunately not really the case with the main opposition parties that took their legitimacy mostly from foreign countries, what we used to call the friends of Syria, whether the West or Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. And this was a shame. And this is why I was saying that the lack of putting forward, I think, this kind of social justice, and also the lack of providing an alternative that could appeal to large sections of society, which is important. So on this last point, I think it was very clear what I wanted to say. And I agree with John when he said, the uprisings of the Middle East and North Africa did not remain only in the region. It has an international appeal. If you remember the US Occupy movement, people were saying we want to do like the Egyptians on Tahrir, where they were occupying the main place, and you had Occupy basically, appearing in hundreds of countries, just as you had the movement in the Spanish state that was called that would create afterwards Podemos was mostly also from the Occupy movement. So you had direct appeal also in sub-Saharan African states. You had, various revolts in Burkina Faso and others that were, basically taking, ideas from Middle East and North Africa. But moreover, I think the most important thing that what the uprisings brought back is the ideas that revolutions are possible. The ideas that, with the movement of mobilizations of millions of people, you can put down, you can overthrow dictators that have been in place for decades. And I think this was important for sections of the left, and this appeal, this from mobilization from below. To come back to the main questions, I think it was Ken that asked about Rifat al-Assad that came back. It was mostly because he had to leave, his prison sentence in France, and he's not a threat to Bashar al-Assad, and he will not be able to build a power base like in the past. He's very much elderly, not in very good health. And in most of the areas where he had the brother of Bashar al-Assad with his fourth division is much more influential today. And I think he's seeking more kind of a collaboration with Bashar al-Assad than seeking, kind of being a rival towards him. So it's not, and even in the Syrian official newspapers, it was said that he was able to come back, but without any kind of social and political role to play inside Syria. This is an official newspaper in Syria that said it. But I don't believe that he will be, a threat to Bashar al-Assad. When it comes, I think it was from the, it's written on my screen, Trinity's iPad, the question regarding minorities, etc. Yes, the Alawites constitute around 10 to 12% of the population. And yes, the dictator Bashar al-Assad is from this community, and he has built, the most important generals and security in the security apparatus are from the Alawite background, let's say bluntly. But they are mostly from his family or a similar kind of tribal background, let's say, but not all Alawites benefits from this regime. And this is something very important. This is not an Alawite regime, as some people have said, but it is a regime that instrumentalizes sectarianism to divide people, and it's a way to dominate society as well, and to divide people from each other, to scare them, etc., from the Sunni to the Alawite, etc. If it was only an Alawite regime, the Syrian revolution would have been ended a while ago. You have 70% of the population that is Arab Sunni. But you do have also, so this regime has support among all the communities in Syria, nearly all the communities, Christians, Sunnis, among the higher middle class, but also among poorer background of Sunnis, etc. Mostly through clientelist deals. This is very important to understand. So it has various ways to reach, or a form of passive hegemony, as I was saying. Passive hegemony does not mean that necessarily people support it, but people at least would basically revolt against it. And this is the main objective of the regime. It knows it cannot, win ideologically speaking, or to win a real hegemony, people, following it, not because only they have material interest into it, but also because, basically, most of the people are afraid of this regime. I don't see any kind of alternative to it. And this is why I was saying that they imposed a form of passive hegemony. So Daesh was not only a threat to non-Muslim minorities, even though non-Sunnis, Muslim minorities obviously were the first target, and we've seen large kidnappings of Syrians, threats on others, etc., but also to Muslim Sunnis that don't want to live under a rule of Daesh. This is important to understand. And not only Daesh, other Islamic fundamentalist forces, they don't want to live in an Islamic state, so let's say bluntly. And this is very clear. So this is why, again, coming back to the issue of building a progressive alternative, democratic alternative is very important. And actually, this is why the Syrian regime wanted this kind of dichotomy between us, the David or the Islamic fundamentalists. This is the best situation for the regime. Plus, it could appeal to the West as well in this so-called war on terror. And this is what we've seen. Basically, the US, the only time they intervened in Syria was basically to intervene militarily against Daesh, and not the same regime, despite all the so-called red lines that were overcome, exceeded, etc. The chemical attacks, etc. So, yeah, I think I answered this question. When it comes to, I think it was Jimmy, the main incentive behind the intervention of Russia was geopolitical, very, very clearly. It's the place of Syria within the Middle Eastern and North African context, and also the various importance, I said, of, and only the importance of economy is coming now, basically, trying to win some of the national resources of Syria, such as phosphate, a bit of oil, etc. But Syria is not a rich country in terms of national resources like Gulf countries. I mean, even before the uprising started 10 years ago, Syria was not anymore self-sufficient in terms of oil production. It had to import some from oil production. But the main incentive for Russia to intervene was geopolitical. This does not mean that today they don't have any economic interest. They do, and they're trying through a deepening of, again, the crisis was used by the regime to deepen its neoliberal policies and privatization policies. Actually, it's following, just like the rest of the Middle East, this policy of PPPs, private-public partnership, that became a key instrument for privatization of the regime to serve businessmen close to the regime and foreign countries close to Syria, such as Russia, and to a lesser extent Iran, that has not benefited massively economy from the Syrian war until today. When it comes to the Kurds, they have various positions, just like, I would like to say, any kind of people. Don't expect the French people to have one single position. It's the same with the British, or etc. Just like the Arabs in Syria don't have a similar political position. It's the same in for the Kurds. Today, the main political party in Syria is the PYD. But before 2011, it wasn't the case. It was the YKT. And today in northern Kurdistan of Iraq, the main political party is the KDP of Barzani, who's a feudal reactionary and who has collaborated with Israel since the end of the 60s, 70s, and has a clear collaboration with the US for a while, and even Turkey, Erdogan, and actually they have collaborated against the PKK and PYD. And you have another one that is from Soleimani, who's a defector of Barzani 30 years ago, which is now PUD, I think. I forgot the name. It's another big family that basically was ruling Soleimani. Soleimani. It's other main northern Kurdish Iraq. And in the Kurdish sector of Iran, you have the Pejad, which is a sister party of PKK that has been growing, but you have also other political parties. And in Turkey, it's the HDP and the PKK. HDP is wider than only the Kurdish part. The PKK has integrated leftist, ecologist, feminist movement. And I think it's very interesting, even though it has a bit sometimes undermined its own socioeconomic issues. I think it's a very important come in to change the nature of the Turkish state, ethno-nationalist. And I think in Syria, also the Kurdish issue opened these possibilities. And when it comes to Syria, the position of the PYD and most of the Kurdish political parties, we have dozens of them, is to have a federal secular system in Syria. And I'm in favor of federal secular Syria. I would just add socialist as well to it. But they are not in favor, of independent, because basically Kurds in Syria are between 10 to 15% of the population, but you don't have like a region where they're a far majority. Even in the northeast, they're only a majority of 55%. So it's not. Most of the Kurds before the uprising were living in Damascus and Aleppo, so they are not in a willingness to have an independence, and this is the main difference with what we had in Iraq. When it comes to Roger, yeah, I wouldn't call Syria in the 60s a deformed worker state. I would say it was a capitalist state, state capitalist state, similar to other kind of Arab nationalist states. And the state of the economy before the uprising was 70% private economy, 30% public. And you had a beginning of privatization of some sectors of the public sector, but not at the level, for example, of Egypt. Let's say that started in the beginning of the 90s. Manufacturing industry still had a quite wide range of public industries, but for example, now they're trying to privatize some of them through the PPP system, which just to tell you, it's a key also axis of for Saudi Arabia in its Horizon 2030. And actually you had I think it was an article by The Guardian or the Financial Times 2 years ago saying, you know, the new Horizon 2030 program, Saudi Arabia is a new Thatcher program because it's wide privatization of wide sectors of the state. What prospects for the future? It's difficult to say. As I was telling you, there's a lot of lessons to be learned. And I think it's about rebuilding resistance from below. What is sure is that the regime is not stable, very far from it, especially without support from its foreign backers. But at the same time, without building an alternative. And this, again, is not a challenge only in Syria. I would say it's the whole wide world today. You see in Europe, it's the same. When you have the rise of the extreme right-wing forces, it's about how to build a leftist alternative. So this is not only a problem that we have, I would say, in the Middle East, but it's a problem that is asking all ourselves, leftist progressive forces, how do we appeal to large sectors of society? How do we ask the right question? How do we build organizations, leftist organization, revolutionary organization that don't only speak between each other, but to speak to the largest majority of the people without losing our principles? And I think the issue today is really, and I'm a big fan of it, especially today, I always has been, but I think it's building, organizations, but also strategy of united front trying, to ally revolutionary organization, but also, more or less democratic ones or, progressive ones, feminist, anti-racist, ecologist, etc., to build, a political alternative that could appeal to large sectors of society. And I think this is really important. And I think the key is through forms of united front, etc. So therefore, Syria have to build on this. We have to end, all the division among the slow sectors of the left. But on the short future, I would say there's still a stabilization of the regime and attempts to normalize, but which is linked to the file of Iran and Syria, Iran and the US, sorry. And if there's a new nuclear deal, I think it would facilitate a normalization of the Syrian regime, which is advancing in the region. And the latest deal that you're seeing on the electricity sector to help Lebanon is going through Syria, and Jordan is pushing towards it. And actually which should fall under the Caesar sanction is not falling because US is basically saying, I put the sanctions whenever I want. And if it's against my interest, I won't put sanctions on Syria, which is a form of saying, basically, Syria is not the main objective and never has been, actually, very far from it. And, normalization is possible, but not for the moment, I think. And unfortunately, Syria will suffer for the near future and the mid future, just as the whole region is suffering. If you see Lebanon today, is 75% of people living under the poverty line. 3 years ago, it was 25% of people living under the poverty line. Iraq is also suffering a lot. You have the various regional forces that are competing among each other, but are ready as well to agree when it comes to putting end to various revolutionary uprisings and wanting to reimpose a form of authoritarian stability, to have, again, new forms of accumulation, etc. So the future is not great, unfortunately, let's say. I think there was one last question of Ed also regarding sectarian ideas, military. Actually, the first producer of sectarianism in Syria is the regime, by its policies of division, of economic blockage, of they will build the state, the nature of the state, etc. But they were also able to redominate militarily, and the military didn't split because it's built in a way where you have the family and close family allies at the head of the military, and there was no strategy of large defections, etc., from the opposition never occurred. But also because of the lack of an alternative program that is inclusive for the vast majority of Syrians, whether minority or not. And this is one of the key problems, I would say. I think I've answered everything.
I think there was quite a comprehensive response to just about every formal question, and where they had a question mark at the end. If anyone wants to make a last-minute addition of just a question, maybe we'll regard it as closed for now. But we do look forward to further exchanges with you in the future, Joseph. As you say, the situation is somewhat quiet, at the moment, but internationally we see explosive developments, particularly as whole regions come to terms with very changing balance of forces, and unusual developments are quite to be expected.